Hi guys, we are very late, but it's been a crazy couple of days. As you heard yesterday with Kayla, our grandmother passed away, and we've been trying to get those arrangements and everything settled down for that. But we are rejoicing because she was a godly woman, and it makes it a lot easier. So. We are going to be reading our Bible story. We're going to continue on with the story of Moses. And I want you guys to tell me if you were familiar with Moses. It's one of the biggest characters in the Old Testament, and he's even talked about in the New Testament too. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we are going to learn that God is faithful to provide even when we sin. And let's read it. I'm going to flip you around. Moses was one of God's people, but he grew up like an Egyptian. He lived in Pharaoh's house and had all the fancy things Pharaoh had to offer. But Moses knew he wasn't an Egyptian. He knew he was one of God's people, and he could see how Pharaoh and most of the Egyptian people treated God's people. The people were beaten. I'm going to show you the pictures over here too. They were forced to do really hard work and not paid fairly for their work. They were not given all they needed to live and to work, but were bullied and sometimes even tortured by Pharaoh, his soldiers, and some of the Egyptian people. Meanwhile, Moses was living a very easy, fancy life. He could just stay in the palace and everything would be fine, but he knew he belonged with God's people. One day he went out of the palace and was walking around where God's people were. He saw how they were being treated, and his heart began to get hard, even hard toward God, because he didn't understand how God could let this happen. Then he saw an Egyptian hitting one of God's people, one of Moses' people, and he lost his temper, and he was filled up with anger. His heart became hard, and he did something that God had commanded that we never do. Moses killed the Egyptian man who had been beating up the other man. He didn't just defend the man who was being hurt. He didn't just stop the fight. Those things would have been wise and what someone with a soft heart toward God would do. But instead, he let the hardness of his heart take over, and he killed the man and buried him in the sand. Then Moses tried to pretend nothing had happened. He went home just like normal. The next day, he saw two of God's people arguing. They had heard about Moses killing the Egyptian man and were scared of him. They asked Moses if he was going to kill them too. Then Moses knew that people had found out what he had done. He was right. Pharaoh knew and tried to kill Moses, even though Moses had been like a son to Pharaoh's daughter. The king had realized Moses was one of God's people, and he would not let one of them kill an Egyptian and go unpunished. So Moses ran. He ran and ran and ran until he was out of Egypt. He came to a land filled with people, God's people, and sat down by a well to get some water to drink. While he was there, 7 sisters came to gather water, but some shepherds turned them away. Moses came to their rescue and watered their sheep. When they got home, they told their father about Moses, and the father asked them to bring Moses to their home so the father could thank him. Moses learned that their father was a priest among God's people. A priest was a man who helped others make sacrifices for their sins. He cared greatly for Moses, and Moses was honored when one of his daughters was given to him as a wife. The Bible doesn't tell us for sure, but it seems that during this time Moses asked God's forgiveness for killing the Egyptians and made the sacrifice he had to make for that sin. Even though Moses had sinned, God was taking care of him. Moses was able to stay among God's people, but he didn't forget about God's people back in Egypt. And God surely hadn't forgotten them either. In fact, God had a plan for his people, a plan for Egypt, and a plan for Moses. God would always keep his promises to them, even though he knew that just like Moses, every one of them would sin. And all of us sin too. Children sin, grown-ups sin. The Bible says all people sin. But God promises he has made the way to forgive us when we admit our sin and ask him for forgiveness. We'll learn more about how he does that when we learn about Jesus. This is from Exodus chapter 2. How did Moses feel about how God's people were treated in Egypt? What did Moses do when he saw an Egyptian beating up one of God's people? After Moses is discovered that people knew he had sinned, what did he do? How do you think Moses felt after he killed the Egyptian and ran away? Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for listening to our Little Lady's Bible story. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Go out and be bold.